Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Veronika Kupriyanova. I'm a Senior Policy Coordinator at the Academic Cooperation Association, and I have the pleasure of moderating this session today. Our session will focus on major innovations in the Key Action 1 of Erasmus+, with a special emphasis on opportunities for staff mobility. Our objective for this session is twofold. On the one hand, we would like to better understand the key changes in the staff mobility scheme under the new Erasmus Plus program. And we are, of course, very curious to learn more about the upcoming opportunities for participation later this year. On the other hand, we would also like to discuss the institutional perspective for staff mobility based on the outstanding challenges that higher education institutions experienced last year and this year, and also in view of the new policy priorities that the European Commission has put forward for the new program. Today, we have two very distinguished speakers with us who will address these two issues from different perspectives. Our first speaker is Johannes Geringa. Johannes is a policy officer at the Higher Education Unit of DG EAC, where he is primarily dealing with the design and management of the Key Action 1 student and staff mobility, as well as cooperation projects and European University alliances. Johannes has a long-standing experience in the EU policy and program making in the field of higher education, and he is a true mobile academic himself, as he has studied in 5 different countries. Our second speaker in this session is Christina Bohle. She's the head of the European office and the Erasmus Plus institutional coordinator at the University of Philipps, Marburg in Germany. Christina is responsible for the university's mobility projects and partnerships, focusing on the structural aspects of quality, student and staff mobility, and on staff competencies in international programs. Christina also serves as an Erasmus Plus expert for the German National Agency, DAD, consulting DAD on issues like international credit mobility, inclusion, and digitalization. Now, before I pass the floor to the speakers, just a few words about today's participation format. We hope to have a very interactive session today, and we will take as many questions as we can after the two presentations. I'd like to encourage you to post your questions to the speakers in the Q&A box that you will find on the bottom of your screens. Please do not hesitate to tweet about the event, and you can find the related hashtags and handles in the chat box. I'm very happy to pass the floor to Johannes now. Johannes, the floor is yours. You can now start sharing your screen.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. I'm happy to present you new opportunities for staff mobility in higher education for the new upcoming Erasmus Plus program. So I'll go with you through the different novelties that we have in store for higher education staff mobility for the call 2021. I will sketch out first the objectives of higher education policy, and then present two major novelties, the blended intensive programs and international staff mobility, but also other novelties like doctoral mobility and digital skills mobility, as well as address what to do in the area of green mobility. So let's start the journey. You know that the European Union is pursuing different horizontal priorities at the EU level, and specifically in for the Erasmus Plus program. The overarching priorities of the program are to allow as many participants to take part in the program, to ensure the inclusion of people with few opportunities for this purpose, for students and staff, and also to support the twin green and digital transformations that are ongoing. With digital transformations, specifically, I'd like to point out that we would like to boost digital education. That means the take-up of ICT means in education, but also to help develop digital skills and to support digitalization in the framework of the European Student Card Initiative, especially digital mobility management. And secondly, staff mobility in the framework of our higher education priorities should also address specific field specific priorities, such as stimulating innovative learning and teaching practices, and to help build inclusive systems to support students in higher education. So let's go to the first major innovation that is catering both to staff but also to students. We'd like to introduce a new activity in higher education mobility, that is the blended intensive programs. Here we'd like to support higher education institutions to develop but also to run short intensive joint courses, study or training courses in a blended way for both students and academic and administrative staff learners. These are short group mobilities between 5 and 30 days, combined with a virtual component that is mandatory. This virtual component can be a collaborative online learning, exchange, and teamwork. At the beginning, the subject matter can be totally bottom-up driven, decided by the higher education institutions that are involved in the blended intensive programs. But we also invite higher education institutions to address the horizontal priorities or the higher education specific priorities in their training as part that is set up through the blended intensive programs. For example, in the different working groups that we had in the run-up and the preparation of the new program, our stakeholders told us that it's very important to train staff, for example, on the quality and relevance of developing relevant staff skills, and also on staff mobility. For example, to work more on the recognition of staff mobility and inclusivity of inclusiveness of staff mobility, but also to link better staff mobility and human resource development policies of the higher education institutions, or to link higher education institutions and the world of work much better, and also to develop further the concept of blended staff mobility. And finally, to address the issues of intercultural communication to help staff become more versatile in their intercultural cooperation. And of course, addressing the green and digital transformations, it's very important that there will be more staff training opportunities to develop environmentally friendly practices, but also to boost, to take further the digital mobility management. So how are blended intensive programs organized? We want to have a partnership of a minimum of 3 higher education institutions in 3 different program countries. The minimum of 15 participants should take part as learners in such blended intensive programs. The coordinating higher education institution, that is typically also the receiving higher education institution, is receiving financial support to develop and run this blended intensive program. On the other hand, other higher education institutions, they request funds for students and staff to take part in these in these blended intensive programs. By requesting funds to send their staff to take part in blended intensive programs, both as learners but also as teachers and trainers. So let's move to the next opportunity that we're providing to the higher education community. There will be more opportunities for international mobility in what is the classic Erasmus scheme, because the classic Erasmus scheme will open up internationally. This international opening means that staff, but also students in program countries can go on mobility to any non-associated country in the world, to any what we now call partner country. The objective of this international opening is twofold. We'd like to develop relevant skills of staff, but also students in Europe, because students and staff in program countries need the global experience to face, to address global challenges. So we need relevant skills, forward-looking skills in the different areas to address the twin transformation. But we also like to make sure that higher education institutions in Europe can establish sustainable international corporations with their partners worldwide. How to achieve this? How to achieve greater inclusion, greater accessibility to this new enlarged mobility opportunities? Well, not only can mobility be to any partner countries on the receiving side, but all higher education institutions that hold a valid charter can request funding and use part of the funding to send students and staff out to to partner countries. So this is a big change compared to previous schemes that already provided opportunities for international mobility. At the same time, this mobility feature and the funds related to it are simple and flexible to use. You know, the classic Erasmus scheme, how flexible the funds can be used between the different mobility activity. What we're foreseeing is that up to 20% of the grant that the mobility project, that a grant beneficiary, such as a higher education institution and the mobility consortium can receive, can be used for funding mobility of students and staff to non-associated countries in the world. But there's no obligation to use these funds. You can also only use 100% of your dedicated funds, the awarded funds for mobility within program countries. And we are making sure as well that there are synergies and complementarities with the external policy funds. For example, that the grant system is aligned between the both. There will be also more opportunities for doctoral mobility. In certain countries, doctoral candidates have the status of staff of higher education. In others, they don't have this staff status. Those with the status of higher education staff can go on short-term mobility as well, well, for training and for teaching. But those who don't, well, traditionally they could only do what all the other students do, go on long-term mobility for studies and traineeships. Now we're introducing as well the possibility for doctoral candidates to go on mobility for a short term for studies and traineeships. So in the future, doctoral candidates have the opportunity to go abroad for physical activity for 5 to 30 days and from 2 months to 12 months for studying and training. That means that for doctoral candidates, a virtual component when they go on short-term physical mobility is optional. They can do it as a blended mobility, or they don't have to do it. By the way, any mobility can be organized as blended mobility or as simply as physical mobility. Here, because at EQF level 8, the opportunities for studying are different. We provide more flexibility and better tailored mobility opportunities for doctoral candidates to boost more mobility, but also to create more links between the world of higher education and the world of research. So you may be aware that the digital opportunity traineeship skill that we introduced 3 years ago has been very successful. We have been able to fund about 17,000 traineeships in advanced digital skills. And now, because digital education, the development of digital skills has come so much more to the fore, we also like to enlarge these opportunities to teaching stuff and administrative stuff through the staff mobility for training opportunities. And so in the future, staff is also invited to take up the different opportunities to develop digital skills. For example, as I sketched out before, digital skills can be developed through blended intensive programs for staff mobility. So this leads me to the last major innovation for staff mobility in higher education, but an innovation that is common as well to any other mobility within Erasmus+. So it's a very horizontal priority to boost the possibility of green mobility. Because the program, which is sending out almost 1 million participants per year, would like to encourage the use of greener means of transport, meaning bus, train, boat, instead of planes. And for doing this, the program will provide a financial incentive, a top-up amount, so that people are taking part in green travel. There will be a higher travel support for those on green mobility, but also the possibility to fund extra travel days for those who take longer in the journey for both ways. So this concludes my short presentation of the new opportunities for staff mobility. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Johannes, for this very informative presentation. We can see the major changes are related to digital, international and green, and I'm pretty sure there will be many questions from the participants about further details regarding these innovations. A quick reminder to the participants, you can post your questions to Johannes in the Q&A box. I would like to invite Christina now to take the floor and to share some of her reflections about the realities and future plans for staff mobility from an institutional perspective. Christina, the floor is yours. Please, you can start your sharing your screen now.
Thank you very much, Veronika, for inviting me to speak here today and to present the institution's perspective on staff mobility in the new program. And good afternoon from my side as well. I'm happy to be here and give you some insights into the institution's experience in Erasmus and the expectations we have for the new program as well. Johannes has already presented the ideas, the new concepts in the Erasmus program that we will start implementing in 2021. But first, allow me to give you a short reflection on what happened in the past year, because from our perspective at the universities, this has had an essential effect on mobility programs in general, and as well, of course, on staff mobility. As you can see here today, first I want to review our experience in times of the pandemic, of the COVID-19 pandemic, and identify how this relates to staff mobility and Erasmus+. Based on these lessons learned, we will have a look at how the higher education environment changed following the consequences of the pandemic. And then we will go back to what has been presented in the beginning, in the first part of our session, and identify what the new program, the new Erasmus program, will offer for staff at the higher education institutions. We will try to identify what new mobility opportunities for staff are relevant and how this fits into the priorities and targets of the institutions. And in the end, I hope to give you some basic ideas, some categories of how staff mobility can be relevant as a strategic instrument for internationalization of the institutions. But first, let me look back into what happened in 2020. And we are, of course, all not surprised at what we can see here today. We are still in the middle of it. But for the mobility programs, of course, and for the higher education institutions, it was a fundamental change indeed. And it all started in 2019 already, but when the World Health Organization declared the epidemic to be a pandemic in March 2020, a new set of changes and regulations took hold. So travel bans and travel restrictions were put into place. Force majeure regulations were implemented in the mobility programs. And for staff mobility, the consequences were quite drastic, of course. At least at the University of Marburg and in most German universities, this meant a cancellation of all staff mobilities. It meant a restriction on business trips by the universities so that only travels that were absolutely necessary were still possible. And this did not include staff mobility for internationalization, of course. And all non-essential events with international guests were cancelled, so that incoming staff mobility was not possible anymore as well. And at that time, we were only talking about physical mobility as the standard type of mobility, of course. And now we are 1 year later, and the status quo is about the same. So it is expected that the travel restrictions will remain in place at least until Easter, and in all probability even longer. So we cannot really expect to have the known traditional kind of staff mobility back in our daily business soon. But of course, the pandemic did not only affect physical mobility, but it affected the whole institutions and the sphere of higher education in general. And for us, this is very relevant in the context of preparing for the new program. A lot of what happened is actually something that has been, in a way, prepared in the announcements of the program. So a lot of scenarios that we had to implement in the last year are something that we actually can use for the new program. So the first thing is, of course, that due to the pandemic, universities had to change their teaching, learning activities fundamentally, and from one day to the next in a way. So the teaching learning environment changed from on-site teaching to online teaching. And this meant that the digital infrastructure at the institutions was established and improved within a very short period of time. Digital skills were established and supported in many institutions, in many universities. Service centers for digital skills, for the support of the faculties, for example, were established. So a lot here happened that had not been happening for many years, even though, of course, the process of digitalization was already talked about and already really, we were all waiting for these changes. And now the institutions were forced to implement what was needed. Of course, we had new mobility scenarios, and this was mostly focusing on student mobility because staff mobility was not really happening, but it's still relevant for what we are talking about today. So suddenly we had to implement online learning, we had to implement blended mobilities, virtual mobilities, and physical mobilities with online learning. And this meant changes in the infrastructure, in the support services, communication, information management. It meant changes on faculty level as well. So staff had to deal with different topics, different procedures. And this, of course, affected not only the processes in our daily business, but it affected the approach to what mobility is and what the goals and priorities in mobility management are. And the cooperations with our partner institutions changed as well. Communication, establishing and ensuring partnerships changed because there was no direct personal contact, no mobility anymore, but at the same time, much more contact in a way, because there was a very intense cooperation to keep the mobility programs going. And in a way, all this meant a cultural change as well at the institutions, because the whole idea of teaching, learning, and the whole idea of mobility and internationalization was undergoing a change as well. So this is, as you can see, very relevant for what we are to implement in the near future with the new Erasmus program. Before I go to the priorities and possibilities of the new program, I want just to give you one example of what we at the University of Marburg try to do to, in a way, try out the new opportunities. This is why I call it an experiment as well, because for us it was the first time. We organized a virtual staff training week, actually at the end of last month, like 2 weeks ago. And for us it was an opportunity not only to ensure and support our partnerships, because there had not been any personal contact for about a year. It was an opportunity to try out how virtual mobility can work and what priorities we have to ensure quality in these activities. With a target group, we tried quite a broad approach. As you can see, we focused on international relations office staff from our KA 103 and KA 107 partner institutions. So we tried to include program as well as partner countries. And we had a very broad thematic approach as well, in a way talking about the new program and crisis and change management. So it was something relevant for everyone. And I just have here some bullet points of what was relevant for us in organizing this kind of mobility activity for incoming staff. Of course, the technical considerations, and I think we all have acquired quite a lot of skills and competences, knowledge of what is relevant and how it could work. Just some keywords here on the right side of the slide of what we had to consider. So in the beginning, which platform we could use, and not only so it is working for us, but to ensure equal access for all the participants. And to ensure, of course, that it is GDPR compliant, that we can, that we refer to the data protection and privacy regulations, which limited the scope of what we could use as well. We wanted to ensure that we could use additional tools and video recordings to make it accessible for colleagues further on as well. And this is where I go to the left side of the slide, because one core element in organizing this kind of program was to ensure that it is an active and interactive participation for all the participants. So I won't go through the whole list of what was relevant and what approaches we used, but from the evaluation of the participants' feedback, we noticed that the core element that they were asking for was to still have interaction and a very active social environment, even in this virtual format. So we try to introduce a number of ways to get an active group working, like breakout sessions, surveys. We gave them a task for the week, so they had something to work on continuously. We had a virtual cultural program, which was very essential for them, because you could notice that for them, it was really, in a way, necessarily replacing a physical mobility. So it was still a process and a process of trying it out as well. But, and that was relevant for us as well, there was very, very much feedback and very many applications and participants in this kind of activity. So for us, it was a great scenario to see what is working and what not. And With this, I want to go to the next topic. Is the new program really a box of delights? So what does it offer? Is there something for everyone if you're talking about staff mobility? And I have here listed the three core types of mobility: virtual, blended, and physical mobility. And as you can see from the design I've chosen, I see these as components that are interlinked and have to work together so that the program as a whole can offer like a complete picture with opportunities for all kinds of priorities, depending on how you define the intended outcome, how you define your target groups. And every format of mobility has some advantages, some disadvantages. The list I have added to the mobility opportunities is of course not complete. It is not objective. It's based on the feedback from our participants. So starting with the virtual mobility as I think the most flexible format with a very wide outreach, because we can have larger groups, it has a relatively easy access. So it is one of the more inclusive opportunities. It offers low barriers for participation. It is more sustainable, more green, because you don't have to travel for short-term mobility. You can design it more target specific, or you can have a wider approach to reach out to more staff categories maybe. But one relevant aspect is that this is more about the transfer of knowledge. It's not so much about developing competences or social skills or a European identity maybe. This is the impression we get from the activities we have implemented so far. And of course, for participants, there's no mobility grant for purely virtual activities. So they have the administrative burden without a mobility grant. And I will get back to the quality criteria that this relates to a bit later on in the presentation. For the blended mobility, I think there's a lot of potential here. It is a flexible format with a wide outreach, but if you can design it in a successive way of activities to enhance quality, you can really design something very targeted and ensuring more of a lasting effect maybe, and include the advantages of a physical mobility with the flexibility of the online learning. So for example, having preparatory online sessions to already establish a group with a group identity, to prepare topics, and then with the on-site training to have a very focused activity. It is more selective because there is a physical part in the mobility scheme. And it is, of course, less green because you do have a short-term mobility where you have to travel. And with staff mobility especially, it is often difficult to really communicate, implement alternative ways to travel. Because if you have a 2-3 day physical mobility and you add 2-3 days traveling because you go by train or bus, this is difficult to communicate to staff that is usually limited in time, really. So this is just some aspects. And for, of course, the physical mobility that we all know, which is more selective because you address smaller groups, but it is more interactive. It contains more of the soft skills, the intercultural competences. So it is more of a complete package, of course. And it is a relevant tool regarding, if I refer to the feedback from participants, to establish and ensure partnerships as well. But we can see that it all works together. And with this question, if one size really fits all, I want to discuss a bit the new mobility opportunities for staff and how we can identify what fits for which purpose and what fits for which target group maybe. I have here the maybe simplest distinguishing between academic staff, so mobility for teaching, and non-academic staff, which refers to the mobility for training. And for the academic staff, traditionally it is more structured because it is based on academic exchange with partner institutions. It is based on the interinstitutional agreements, of course. It is more related to the career development of the academics usually. And in this way, there is maybe usually no formal recognition if we go back to the EU survey results, for example, but often there is an informal recognition in the context of the career development. And there is a close connection to student mobility. So in this way, there is ensured more visibility and more acceptance of these activities for participants. A relevant action, of course, that Johannes mentioned earlier is the doctoral mobility. So these new formats that will address one group of academics that has been left out a bit in the traditional program, as he mentioned as well, because the young academics and doctoral candidates are those who often don't fit quite into this picture. For the non-academic staff, it's more activities on an individual basis. Participants have to identify their mobility opportunities much more by themselves. Usually in institutions, from my experience, there's less visibility and less acceptance for these activities. There is seldom formal or even informal recognition for this activity. So the motivation to participate in these activities is maybe not so high. The format depends a lot on the intended outcome, of course. We have the traditional activities like language training, staff training weeks, job shadowing. So there's many different training options and formats already in place. But transparency, access to this information and these activities is often limited. And to add to this target group, one comment, it is a very diverse group because this, of course, addresses all kinds of staff categories, be it in student services, in accommodation services, law. So there's the decentral offices, there's a lot of staff that is a part of this group, but they don't have the same needs, they don't have the same priorities and not the same access to information and mobility opportunities. So I think this is especially a group where the new mobility formats can offer a lot of chances for staff to participate more actively in the program. You have noticed that there is a lot of elements in the staff mobility that relate to having a more targeted design of mobility options, so that we can address the target groups more specifically, that we have a more diverse approach, and thus ensure the quality of staff mobility. And taken from the experience of implementing outgoing and incoming staff mobility at my own institution and from networking activities, gathering feedback from other institutions as well. Often there is a lack of strategy and a lack of structure in the implementation, so that only a limited number of staff have really access and know about the opportunities and get the support that is needed. And if you want to have an inclusive program for staff mobility, especially non-academic staff as well, there's some elements that are relevant to ensure that this can be the case and that the program can be developed to have an overarching outreach, really. And one is, of course, to relate the mobility activities to the strategic priorities of the institution. And this can be implemented via your selection criteria. You can develop a bonus system. You can ensure clear recognition procedures for staff as well, so that the relevance is visible and potential participants have the motivation to participate. You have to involve stakeholders and your leadership, because if you want to gain acceptance for these diverse mobility options, and if you want to change structures, you have to involve the stakeholders and you have to gain support from your leadership. And with the stakeholders, you have to see that you have a close cooperation, for example, with HR, with the human resources, staff development departments, for example, if you want to really have a strategic approach. And with the diversity of mobility opportunities that the new program presents, there is potential to really build up a proper structured program so everyone can identify those mobility options relevant for themselves. This is why here is this element of designing target-specific training opportunities, especially if there is maybe no funding or only limited funding, or if there is physical mobility involved. So staff has to get the support to get away from work for a couple of days. You do need very clearly defined outcomes, intended outcomes for the activities to get the recognition, the support. And this is where the two next bullet points come into place, to enhance the visibility of the program and to ensure the recognition of the activities. And these are elements that so far in the Erasmus program, with this quite limited approach to staff mobility, is not sufficiently supported so far in most institutions. So that especially the training opportunities for non-academic staff are often not really inclusive in addressing all areas of the institutions. And with this, actually, I'm at the end of my presentation, and I thank you for your attention. And I hope that my comments could trigger some processes at your institutions maybe as well, and help you identify relevant aspects that you think could be worthwhile following up on at your institutions as well. And thank you. I'll hand over again to Veronika.
Thank you very much, Christina, for this very insightful presentation. It's very interesting indeed to learn more about Marburg's experience in applying new formats of staff mobility. And I find it particularly very interesting and relevant, but also quite impressive to see how much hard work lies behind crafting a quality mobility experience for staff. And this applies both to physical mobility, but it's even more the case for blended and digital mobility, that is new formats of mobility. Also, thanks for offering some guidance on how to maximize the institutional impact of staff mobility based on target-specific training opportunities, and also a greater role of recognition. That is obviously a very important area for action for many institutions. I suggest we now move on to the questions that we have received from the audience. So I suggest that we take the questions from the audience now, and we have quite many questions indeed. Johannes, there are quite quite a couple of questions for you, because there is obviously big interest among the participants in the new opportunities. As you have probably seen, and there are quite many questions about the specific modalities of blended intensive programs. So people actually are curious about the duration of mobility. So is there any minimum time for mobilities, including both physical and virtual components? Then there's a question about the fitness for purpose. Perhaps you could give us some examples of how specifically blended intensive programs could be used for academic and non-academic staff. There's also a question about the number of mobilities that could be allowed within such programs, and who can actually coordinate such new activities. Are these only higher education institutions, or perhaps NGOs could also be the coordinators? So I hope you will be able to give us some cues about this new program.
Thank you, Veronika. I'm happy to answer the questions, and I see that there's a lot of interest in blended intensive programs. Well, just as a starter, I would like to say that this is this new activity is a blend of different previous experiences and activities. It's based on the intensive study programs of Erasmus and Erasmus Plus for students. It's based on the blended mobility concept, and it's based on the staff training events that we had under the strategic partnerships. So it's a federation, a joint concept. That is why when it comes to the virtual part of the blended intensive program for staff learners, we don't have a limitation. We leave it up to the partnership to design it, appropriate measures of virtual collaboration before, during, and after the physical part. It's also because, as you know, in terms of funding, we already supported short-term staff mobility, while short-term student mobility is new. So this is also well, a reason for this difference, which well, we have to see with experience if we have to define other parameters for the participation and the organization of blended intensive program for staff, but only what time will tell, and we are collecting this experience with youth higher education institutions. Well, when it comes to other questions?
Yeah, there was a question.
Would you like to go with me through the different questions, question by question?
Yes,
Veronika?
yes. Let's do it like this. So there was still a question about the minimum duration of mobility, and then the number of mobilities that could be covered within the blended intensive programs, and the coordination eligibility, whether NGOs are eligible to coordinate this new type of instrument.
Well, as for students, the minimum participation time in the physical mobility, the physical part of blended intensive programs is 5 days, 5 consecutive days, plus also funded travel days if necessary. Because we are providing an overhead funding to the organizers for organizing the blended intensive program, so there has to be a value for money as well. And well, this is roughly a working week, and so it's also based on previous experience that higher education institutions have organized for staff. Just to make a distinction, staff learners have to stay a minimum of 5 physical days abroad, but when it comes to teachers and trainers, they can stay well, 1 or 2 days minimum as the program requires.
Okay, and I think still we have a question about the coordination. So are there any restrictions towards different types of organizations to coordinate?
Well, the coordinator has to be a higher education institution with a valid charter. Well, if an NGO has a charter because it's a learning institution, well, yes, of course, it's relevant. It's eligible. But NGOs can also be partners in such a partnership of 3 higher education institutions, and can also provide some training or learning opportunities as part of a blended intensive program. So it's possible. But as such, the coordinator and the receiving higher education institutions have to be charter holders.
That's great.
And yes, please.
Okay, another question about funding arrangements for different types of blended activities, and that's a question that is coming from my side actually. So how will the virtual components of blended activities be covered for the participants?
Well, as I said before, we leave it totally up to the involved higher education institutions to organize it according to needs. For example, there have been projects under the strategic partnership action, for example, on blended staff mobility, that elaborated different modules for blended staff mobility. But much more has to be developed in this sense. What is fit for purpose, and yeah, what is fit to the training needs for staff.
Thank you, Johannes. We have still a clarifying question on the duration of mobility. So we understand that there should be a minimum 5 days for physical mobility. Is there any minimum limit for the virtual component of mobility?
No, there's no limit as such. For students, we defined a total workload of 3 ECTS credits, but ECTS credits do not apply for staff. If, well, as a guiding line, you could take the workload for students, but it's really up to the involved institution to define it, what is really useful.
Okay. We also have one question for Christina in the chat box about the recognition of mobility experience for staff. Perhaps you could tell us a bit more, Christina, about how you approach this at your university. You have also taught us about possible incentives to promote actually and to advance staff mobility. So it would be interesting to learn a little bit about how to raise interest of staff actually, particularly in the new types of mobility. We know that the interest of staff in virtual components of mobility has been quite limited during the pandemic due to different reasons. So partly because staff was facing other issues, and they had simply no time to take this kind of experience. But probably also due to some other reasons, maybe related also to the quality of the new experiences emerging. So how do you do this at Marburg?
First, concerning recognition, you added in your question already, of course, some aspects that are related. According to the recognition in my presentation, I focused a lot on the relevance of recognition. And one reason is because at our institution, it's still not working properly. So I don't have, unfortunately, the great solution for this issue. For the staff mobility for non-academic mobilities, non-academic staff mostly, we are working with a staff development unit on an international certificate. So trying to make the activities more visible and combining activities, for example, language competence, intercultural competence, and then mobility activities to include them into the staff development catalog of the university. And we hope that this could make it more interesting for staff that has not been involved so far in the mobility programs. I see a great chance with a more flexible online activities for staff actually, and if it's just as a kick-off activity for participants. And this relates a bit to one of the other questions in the chat, like how to disseminate the staff mobility and how to maybe use the reports from former participants to make it more visible. And here I noticed the colleague mentioned that they tried to do like physical presentations, organize information events, inviting former participants. We did the same, and with a lot of organizational work and not so much effect. And now with the online formats, we have started to be more active in disseminating these activities and opportunities, recording sessions, and addressing staff more often maybe as well. So to make visible what is included, what variety of activities are included in the program. And our idea is a bit that by participating maybe in online events, and if it's just a workshop maybe from a partner institution or something, to get into this context, into the network of international activity, and to have it as a first activity, gaining some competence, some confidence as well as regards language competence, for example, and then to actually start getting involved in the physical mobilities as well. But this is a very, very difficult aspect, especially as it's such a diverse target group, as I mentioned earlier, and depending on the target group and on the structural aspects as well, it's very different how you can approach this topic.
Indeed, that's a very, very challenging topic. Johannes, now back to you. There are a couple of questions about the international dimension of the action, and there are particularly two questions. So one about reciprocity. So can incoming mobility be also funded? So for higher education institutions, when they negotiate actually agreements, they need to also they need to rely on reciprocity, and they require funding for outgoing students and staff. That's one question. And another question here also with regard to the international dimension is about the respect of students and staff rights. The basic rights of students and staff are typically covered by the charter. So the question is what happens in the case of non-associated partners when we open up 20% of mobility under the action to non-associated countries.
Yes. Okay, yes, I'll take the two questions on the international mobility. Well, the first question concerns the mobility flows under the call 2021. It's the first year of this new open international opening of higher education, traditional higher education mobility. We will start with outgoing mobility of students and staff. As far as staff is concerned, well, I think it's less of an issue for staff mobility because we are allowing staff mobility for teaching and staff mobility for training. Staff mobility for teaching to partner country higher education institutions offers an advantage both to the sending and to the receiving higher education institutions, because this promotes the internationalization of the partner higher education institution at home, so that their students and staff get more exposed to international experience. So there's a kind of reciprocity element as well. So because when the same European higher education institution sends a staff member for training to the same partner country higher education institution, of course, yes, well, it can also be beneficial for both, a learning experience for both. So yes, but well, we also rely on the experience of our partners, of our stakeholders and higher education institutions to provide us feedback as well, how it goes for the first year. Anyway, we'll see how then things will develop. When it comes to the basic rights of students and staff, which are enshrined in the Erasmus Charter for Higher Education that we've just renewed for almost 5,000 higher education institutions. Well, and how does it work with higher education institutions in partner countries, actually? And here, it's the same mechanism as under the current ICM action, the International Credit and Staff Mobility Action, funded by external instruments, where we have an interinstitutional agreement between the European higher education institution and the partner country higher education institution, where the partner country higher education institution, by signing the interinstitutional agreement, also signs up to all the Erasmus Charter principles. So this is the same. So we will use the same template as for our colleagues that are in charge of the international credit mobility. That is supposed to be continued from call 2022 on. So there will be the synergies that I outlined before.
All right, that's great. We are approaching the end of this session, but we still have two questions for you, Johannes, again. So one is about the financial incentives for green mobility. So when we will know more actually about the details, I suppose when the call is out, there will be more details regarding specific ways to implement that. Yes, I see you nodding. And then there's another question about support for increased language skills for staff. So will there be specific opportunities for that under the new program?
Yeah, thank you. Staff mobility receives individual support, but also travel support, depending on the travel distance band. And we have designed a system that when, well, mobility participants take greener means of transport, they get a financial incentive, a kind of financial markup on their grant related to the distance band. And well, according to the distance band, the The extra funding for taking greener means of transport is between 30 and 80 euros, up to the distance spent up to 4,000 kilometers, because beyond 4,000 kilometers, it will be harder to take like buses or trains, obviously. But we also foresee well extra funded travel days. Well, we have to see how this is taken up by staff mobility. It's more geared to student mobility and maybe shorter distances. So obviously within Europe, when we have fast trains, for example, between Paris and Cologne, and between, well, other major European destinations. As far as the language skills are concerned, we are redoing the way we deliver language services to Erasmus Plus participants. Especially, we would like to also give opportunities to mobile staff to participate in the future OLS, the online language service, to train in languages. This is the major contribution of boosting the language competences in Europe as such. And let me also benefit from having the floor to also stress the fact that we'd like to give much more opportunities to well, people with few opportunities as well. This is also relevant for staff mobility, because we'd like to all staff, teaching and administrative staff, to have the possibility of a fair and equitable access to mobility opportunities. That means also staff from underrepresented departments or underrepresented areas. So it's up to the higher education institutions also to devise some inclusion and diversity plans, how to ensure this, so that other staff members didn't have the chance yet to participate in such opportunities. Also, of course, in line with the higher education or development strategy, obviously, as Christina also outlined. Okay.
All right, that's great. Thank you very much, Johannes, for these additional explanations. I hope they are useful to our participants who are preparing their projects already now, I suppose. Thank you very much, Christina, to you as well. It was a very inspiring presentation, and I'm pretty sure it has indeed triggered further thinking about staff mobility among our participants, and hopefully they will be able to report back to the institutions about your experience. I have to close this session now, so there will be the final panel now, looking at credit and staff mobility last year and this year. So we need actually to leave this platform and go back to the main platform. So you have received the main link in the communication with us. Please now close this platform and click on the link that we have provided earlier to you in the email. So we hope you enjoyed this session. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.